So welcome everybody, and we are very pleased to see so many students here in spite of the heavy monsoon season. The tradition at the London School of Economics is to start with introducing oneself. So my name is Ruth Kattumuri. I'm the co-director of the India Observatory at the London School of Economics. I would firstly like to thank the Vice-Chancellor and the Pro-Vice Chancellor for giving us permission to use this beautiful venue, which actually reminds some of us of the Mansion House in London. And I also thank them for all their support and guidance in associating with us for doing this event as a joint event. I would also like to thank the Maharashtra Election Commission, which has played a central role in helping us to get permission to secure this venue. Above all, I would also like to thank Mrudul Neele and Mala Lalwani from the Mumbai University, without whom we could not have managed this, because we just arrived and all this has happened with remote communication and a lot of follow-up locally. When a friend of mine suggested this as a venue, it was exciting. I thought it was an exciting idea and that it would be great. We can open it out to have several students from across Mumbai universities and colleges. And so it's great that we have students and staff from multiple colleges in Mumbai. But when we actually started working on the planning of the event, we saw the reality of all the loops that we had to jump through. Not least among those are the monsoon weather, which we are surrounded by just now, the holiday season, and the multiplicity of diary clashes, the Mumbai traffic congestion, and of course, under these circumstances, it's good that people are able to access these kind of programs online, and it's going to be recorded so that it will be available for people who wanted to come but could not be here today but can still access online. And we're delighted that all of you have braved all these challenges and have been able to make it to be with us here today. So the IG Patel Chair and the India Observatory at the LSE was set up in 2006 in partnership with the Reserve Bank of India and the State Bank of India. Some people who were involved in the setting up of this are here with us today, and I'd like to name a couple of people. Sandeep Ghosh from the Reserve Bank of India and Mr. O.P. Bhatt, former chairman of SBI, are with us here today. I'd also like to mention Mrs. Usha Thorat, who was Deputy Governor, and she's also here with us today. Dr. Y.V. Reddy, who was the governor, who's former governor of RBI, he was extremely keen to come and be with us here today, but he was unable to join us. So also Mrs. IG Patel, who lives in Baroda, was keen to come, but both of them have been unable to join us, but they send us their very best wishes. This is the 7th IG Patel Lecture, and it's being organized in association with Mumbai University and the State Bank of India. And we have with us the chairman of SBI, Mr. Rajneesh Kumar, and he and his wife, Rita Kumar, are dear friends of many years, and we appreciate all the support from SBI. Mr. Rajneesh Kumar actually rescheduled an SBI award ceremony to accommodate us this event today. This lecture is being given by Dame Minouche Shafik, who is the director of the London School of Economics. Like IG Patel, she has been with the Central Bank in England, and she's now the director of LSE. With this, I hand you over to Professor Lord Nicholas Stern, who is the IG Patel professor at the London School of Economics.
Thank you very much, Ruth. As the IG Patel professor at the LSE, it's a special pleasure to introduce the IG Patel Lecture and the IG Patel Lecturer, who's been a colleague and friend for many decades. But let me first join Ruth in thanking Mumbai University and all involved in the organization of this lecture. It's a lovely place to be, and it's a real privilege to be able to hold it here. And I know it was a lot of work to make it happen. And thank you, Rajneesh Kumar, for being with us. And I will ask you to say a few words after we've listened to Minouche, just responding, and then we'll open up the discussion to the audience. And I know there are many LSE alum who are here, and you will all know that it is not the practice in LSE to dwell on agreement. So I'm sure there'll be lots of questions and discussion after the lecture. Now, Minouche, or Dame Minouche Shafik, has had a very impressive career. That's British understatement. She was the youngest vice president at the World Bank. She was the permanent secretary, that's like secretary to the government of India. She was permanent secretary at the Department for International Development. She was the deputy managing director of the IMF, dealing with many problems, not to mention Greece. Well, to mention Greece. And then she was deputy governor of the Bank of England and dealt with a number of problems, including making sure that the Bank of England was probably the only institution in the country that was properly prepared for the Brexit vote in June 2016. So the fact that the economy didn't go bad was in large measure due to Minouche. She did, going back a little further, she did get a doctorate from Oxford, but far more important is that her MSc is from the London School of Economics. So the subject is, as you know, social contracts for the 21st century. And of course, we'll leave it to Minouche to develop that idea. But let me just remark that it is a subject that has run through the London School of Economics from its very beginning. And it's a subject that has been led in many ways, or ideas on it have been led in many ways by directors of the London School of Economics. So we're looking forward very much to hearing from Minouche how she will shape the story of social contracts for the 21st century. Minouche, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick, for that kind introduction. What Nick neglected to mention, of course, was that I was also his student when I was a student at the London School of Economics. And as you know, we always honor our professors. It's a real pleasure and a true honor to be giving the IG Patel Memorial Lecture in this magnificent Mumbai University Convocation Hall. IG Patel was the 9th director of the London School of Economics and the 14th governor of the Reserve Bank of India. This isn't working. And this is him. His distinguished career spanned key roles in the Indian civil service, at the IMF and UNDP, and of course at the Reserve Bank of India, where he had to navigate through a balance of payments crisis triggered by the second oil price shock. He was the first person from India to lead a higher education institution in the United Kingdom. And it's not really a surprise because he was terribly clever. He achieved the highest score ever achieved in the matriculation exam in India. And he was considered the best student of his career by his tutor at King's College, Cambridge. And by all accounts, he was an incredibly soft-spoken but very, very effective person. During his tenure at the LSE as director, he increased the number of international students, established new centers, enhanced research funding, expanded the library and student accommodation. And he is remembered with great affection and gratitude. He's also a wonderful example of the rich vein of collaboration that has existed between India and the LSE since its founding in 1895. LSE recruited students from India from the very beginning, and probably the most well-known alumna of the LSE is Ambedkar, who is, of course, famed for his role as a social reformer and the principal architect of the Indian Constitution. It's probably less well known that his doctoral dissertation, which was called The Problem of the Rupee, Its Origins and Solution, and his subsequent testimony before the Royal Commission on Indian Currency and Finance actually led to the establishment of the Reserve Bank of India. And of course, the other great figure who is connected to the LSE was Mahatma Gandhi, who spoke to his largest audience in Britain in LSE's Old Theatre in 1931. Now, I often joke that Oxford and Cambridge trained the people who ran the empire, but the LSE trained the people who overthrew the empire, and also trained those who led it in the independence period. Probably the most famous overthrower was Harold Laski, who's pictured here on the right. His ideas about how socialism could coexist with pluralism was highly influential in shaping thinking about Indian democracy in the 1940s and 1950s. And his early commitment to India's independence and his teaching of many of those who led the country in the early years was widely recognized, including Krishna Menon, who became the first High Commissioner to the UK, G.L. Mehta, who became India's ambassador to the US, Renuka Ray, who was president of the All India Women's League. But of course, the LSE, like most Indians, love a good argument. And economists of the right, such as Lionel Robbins and Frederick Hayek, shaped the views of many more pro-market thinkers like A.D. Shroff, who represented India at the Bretton Woods Conference. I wanted to mention perhaps a little less well-known collaboration between the LSE and India. Which is the story of what the role that Sir Ratan Tata played in the creation of the field of social policy. So originally, Sir Ratan wanted to support research into poverty reduction in India at an institution in Bangalore. But the British authorities at the time, according to the diaries of Beatrice Webb in 1912, were, quote, so afraid of any intellectual development among the Indians that because it finds that intellectual development always leads to a desire for self-government. So instead, after a visit to India by the founders of the LSE, Beatrice and Sidney Webb, Sir Ratan made a donation of £1,400 to the LSE annually. And he created a new department to study social policy, and the first person he employed to work there was Sir Clement Attlee, who went on to become Britain's Prime Minister. And when he became Prime Minister, he could fulfill his lifelong view that India should be independent. One can't help but admire the irony of this story, that, as well as the wisdom of Sir Ratan Tata in thinking that knowledge is truly global and that the LSE was a place that could generate ideas that could benefit India and the world. His support lasted for 20 years, funded research on poverty, on minimum wages, on welfare policy, and trained a whole generation of social workers around the world. And the social policy department at the LSE, which he created, is the legacy of that funding and is now ranked the top social policy department in the world. It became what I think is really the nucleus of the distinctive intellectual tradition that characterizes LSE. The search for both economic success and social values. And that intellectual tradition influenced many, many subsequent thinkers, including the work of the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, who changed the way that we thought about rights, justice, welfare, and famines, and for whom we recently named a chair at LSE. And the story between LSE and India continues today. We've taught over 10,300 Indian students and have over 60 faculty doing research on India across a whole array of disciplines: economic history, anthropology, law, geography, and of course, economics. Lord Nick Stern is the IG Patel Professor of Economics and Government and continues his 4-decade-long association with Palanpur and with more contemporary issues like climate change. Lord Meghnad Desai has an academy named in his honor here in Bombay, teaching economics. Our International Growth Center has commissioned over 300 pieces of research on India in collaboration with policymakers and researchers in India to focus on key development challenges, ranging from how can we use machine learning to help identify firms evading value-added tax, to how do we design measures to empower young girls in India, to how do we increase energy supply and reduce pollution. And LSE conducts extensive training programs for future leaders, including the Achieving Indian Parliamentarians program and programs for officials in the Indian Revenue Service and the Indian Economic Service and the RBI. Now, building on this extraordinary history that we have between the LSE and India, I wanted to focus on an issue that I think has been at the center of many of the collaborations between India and LSE in recent decades. That fundamental question of how to marry economic growth with a fair society based on a well-understood social contract that defines the rights and obligations of citizenship. What should a citizen expect, and what do we owe each other as citizens? What's the role of the state relative to families, communities, and the private sector? How has the social contract changed over time, and what should happen in the future? I will argue that many of the tensions in today's world, in particular the rise of divisive politics and populism, are rooted in the failure of our social contract to adapt to new economic and social realities. So let me start with a definition. What do I mean by the social contract? Well, all of us engage in the social contract every day of our lives through our interactions with families, co-workers, and the state. In all countries, people are expected to contribute to the common good when they are productive adults, and in exchange, they get an education when they're young and support when they are old and when they are sick. How much support does a society owe an individual, and what does an individual owe in return in the form of individual responsibility, taxes, and voluntary contributions? And why do we give our money through the tax system to complete strangers who we will never meet? And why do we do this across generations? Every society is built on a web of obligations rooted in norms, institutions, policies, and laws that require us to support those who need it as part of the social contract. In more traditional societies, those responsibilities tend to be borne by families and communities. In more advanced economies, a greater burden is borne by the state and the market through things like health insurance or pension schemes. And that balance between the state and the market is the fundamental divide between the left and the right in politics. Now, the social contract is not synonymous with the welfare state. In fact, huge parts of the social contract continue to be provided by families. For example, all that unpaid labor that we as parents give to our children to educate them and support them, or through families pooling resources in times of ill health or unemployment. Communities, charitable organizations, voluntary organizations do a huge amount to care for the needy and the elderly, responding to humanitarian crisis and supporting people to get back to productive work. Employers are often required to provide elements of the social contract, for example, through mandatory contributions to health insurance or other benefits such as pensions. It's also important to remember that the welfare state is not just about transferring income from the rich to the poor. It's more about smoothing income and consumption over the life cycle. Have a look at this data for the UK. Aha, my battery's running low. Can someone help me with that? Okay, let's see if... Aha. There we are. Consider this data for the United Kingdom, which shows the transfer of resources between individuals and the state over the course of their lives at different ages. And what you see is that most people take resources out when they're very young, in their early years on the left, and when they're very old, through investments in education and through pensions and healthcare. Most people pay into the state, the green line, which is the hump, through their productive working years. Nick Barr of the LSE argues that the welfare state is actually 3/4 piggy bank, where we save and provide each other mutual insurance over our life cycle, and only 1/4 Robin Hood, taking money from the rich and giving it to the poor. And John Hills of LSE has shown that most people put as much into the welfare state as they take out. So the welfare state is not just about protection, it's also about productivity. So let me just take you through a very quick gallop of a brief history of the welfare state and how it's evolved in different parts of the world. In the early stages of development, dealing with poverty and economic shocks is really the business of families and communities. As countries get richer, more of the social contract tends to be delivered by the state as citizens demand a more equitable share of the growing pie. In the UK, the first person to actually call for a national health service was one of the founders of LSE, Beatrice Webb, in her Royal Commission on the Poor Law in 1909. But William Beveridge, who was one of my predecessors as director of the LSE, was the first person credited with providing a comprehensive blueprint of the welfare state to meet the needs of citizens from cradle to grave, as he said. To vanquish the 5 giants, as he called them, squalor, ignorance, want, illness, and disease, Beveridge's plan for social insurance was based on flat-rate contributions, providing universal benefits to all citizens. Now, welfare states evolved very differently in other parts of the world. In Anglo-Saxon countries like the US and Australia, there was much greater emphasis on individual responsibility and contributions, low levels of transfers, and a real emphasis on means testing. Implicit in that view is a social contract that relies very heavily on individual responsibility. Families are responsible for caring for their children. The private sector can provide a lot of education and health insurance, and a very minimalist support, a minimalist view of income support, and a heavy reliance on insurance markets to help people manage risks such as accidents. In continental Europe, systems were often linked to work effort and related to social contributions by employers and employees to pay for benefits. In the Nordic countries, you tended to have very high levels of taxation and state financing combined with universal and targeted benefits and fairly generous support. Countries with more homogeneous populations tended to develop more comprehensive welfare states, whereas countries with greater racial and ethnic diversity, like the United States, tended not to do that. But one pattern that is universal is that all countries built their welfare states on the assumption that women looked after the young and the old for free. Now, in recent decades, there has been an explosion of growth in safety nets and social protection in developing countries that historically had relied much more on families and communities for social protection. The number of developing countries that now have some form of social protection has doubled in the last 20 years. So from only 72 to 149 as of 2017. The majority of countries, about 70%, have some form of unconditional cash transfer to poor households. 43% have schemes that are conditional on things like sending your children to school or immunization. More than 80% of countries now have school feeding programs. 67% use public works. 56% have various fee waivers. The number of countries with old age social pensions has also grown massively in the last 2 decades. Most developing countries spend about 1.5% of GDP on average, but this still only covers about 1/3 of the poor globally. But these programs are growing very quickly because there's huge amounts of evidence that they have big social benefits in terms of school enrollment, nutrition, prenatal and postnatal care, health outcomes, and economic activity. So let me turn to why I think the social contract is failing in many advanced economies. Why do we see this huge rise in divisive politics and populism around the world? Now, many people blame globalization and nationalism, and I'm sure that those are part of the explanation. But I think they're actually second-order issues. I think the fundamental explanation lies in the pressures on our social contracts and the inability to adapt to major economic, social, and environmental changes. And those pressures derive primarily from technology, but also the changing role of women and climate change. I think much of the current debate in many countries is rooted in the fact that people feel they were owed something and they've been disappointed. Those born into disadvantage feel they were never given a chance to thrive. Those who live in rural areas feel that disproportionate attention has been given to cities. Older people feel the young are not grateful for their past sacrifices. Native populations feel that immigrants are changing their societies and receiving benefits that may be before their due. Men feel their historic entitlements are being threatened by newly empowered women and policies such as quotas and targets that discriminated against them. The young increasingly resent the elderly, who consume a growing share of resources in health and pensions, while leaving them with a legacy of environmental destruction. Now, the last decade has seen a rise in populist politics fueled by insecurity in many countries. Technological change, accelerated by globalization, and the resulting integration of global supply chains has enabled huge gains for the middle class in the emerging economies. This chart shows you what's happened to global income distribution. And what you can see is that those who've experienced the biggest gains in income distribution across the whole world's population have been the top 1% who've done very well, and that big bulge in the middle, which is the middle class in the emerging markets. The group that suffered the most is the middle class in the advanced economies, which is the dip on the right-hand side. And the conventional wisdom has been that workers in the advanced economies have had to compete through lower wages and lower social protection, resulting in downward pressure on their incomes. Because capital is highly mobile with globalization, the downward pressure has intensified. Social mobility, which made inequality a bit more tolerable, with the hope of equal opportunity, has actually fallen in most advanced economies. And I would argue that the pressures from technological change and globalization could have been managed if the social contract had provided people with insurance against those risks. Minimum pay when they were unemployed, opportunities to retrain, and assurance that they and their families would get access to good education, healthcare, and jobs. Current welfare states in the advanced economies are actually still designed for an old economy, where you had a single male breadwinner who got married, had a steady job over a lifetime that provided a reliable pension, and that children are raised in families with a woman who's there to care for the young and the old for free. Yet for the first time in history, there are now more women going to university globally than men. Educated women have fewer children, are more likely to be in paid work, and will increasingly feel tensions between their employment and caring responsibilities. Encouraging the use of all of this female talent is clearly economically beneficial. Recent research from the IMF has showed that closing gender gaps has significant benefits for growth, but not just for growth, but for productivity, because all workers are more productive, because their individual talents are more efficiently allocated in an economy where women are working. So the challenge is how to redefine the social contract in a way that enable women to use their talents while preserving social cohesion. In advanced economies, this is manifested in debates about childcare, social care, declining birth rates as women reduce their fertility as a way of coping with this tension. Similarly, aging means that the support that the working age population needs to provide in the form of healthcare and pensions to a rapidly growing older population puts huge fiscal pressure on countries. And the growth of precarious work has meant that the working age population have less security than their elders because of the decline of defined benefit pensions, no access to sick pay or training opportunities. Now, on climate, much has been said about the science and the economics, and much of it has been said by Nick. But I want to focus on climate change as a breakdown of the intergenerational social contract to leave our children an environmental legacy equivalent to that which we inherited. The massive protest that we see around the world by young people is indicative of their frustration with an economic model that does not take adequate account of the environment. And this is despite all the growing evidence on the negative effects and the possibility of alternative economic models that could enable development alongside protecting the planet. So what could a different social contract, more appropriate to the 21st century, look like? Well, education might occur both earlier, since the early year as education is a critical foundation for learning later in life, and also later as reskilling becomes necessary. And it might be focused increasingly on skills that robots can't do. Serious investment in reskilling, which no country except Denmark and maybe the Netherlands do, would be essential to enable workers to reskill throughout their lives. It might be necessary to provide people with a minimum income, but in a way that's structured, that encourages the incentives to continue to work and retrain. Things like earned income tax credits or mandatory training and work placements or employment guarantees. And to better use the growing pool of female talent, we'd need to make real investments in childcare, shared parental leave, and elderly care, as well as addressing the legal and social biases that discriminate against women. Part-time work could become more common, with benefits made portable and provided pro rata. And for longer-term sustainability, we need to think differently about aging and the environment. If fewer young people have to support a larger aging population in the future, we need to make huge investments in them now to make sure that they're very productive. Aging populations have to commit to work longer, and healthcare at the end of life needs to be less medicalized. Retirement ages should be linked mechanically to life expectancy so that aging is made more fiscally affordable. Environmental costs need to be reflected in economic decisions, and a massive program of investment in green technologies is necessary to transform our cities, our energy systems, and our transport. So that's my story for the advanced economies. Let me turn to India and how India has redefined its social contract in recent decades. Now, every Indian government has put reducing poverty and improving livelihoods at the center of its agenda, and the Sustainable Development Goals have provided an international framework for thinking about those objectives. The Indian government and successive Indian governments have taken greater responsibility for delivering aspects of the social contract since independence, but particularly in the 1990s and 2000s, as a series of rights-based laws were passed, including on national rural employment in 2005, on education in 2009, and on food security in 2013. Real per capita spending by the central government and the states on education and health more than doubled from the 1970s to the mid-2000s. And social security spending on the elderly and the poor increased fourfold. And this reflected rapid change as incomes rose, urbanization occurred, and the state was increasingly called upon to deliver on citizens' demands for jobs, housing, education, and healthcare. Now, building a welfare state has been particularly challenging in a place like India, probably more than any other country in the world, given its continental scale, federal system, and complexity in terms of languages, religions, and caste. But as in the advanced economies, just as technological and social changes will affect the evolution of the social contract in India as well, the rise of machine learning and automation will mean that India is unlikely to follow the path of the East Asian countries that relied on labor-intensive, export-oriented manufacturing in order to transition to middle and high incomes. how will India grow an economy in which most workers will go from agriculture directly to services with no transition through manufacturing? How will demographic and social changes affect that process? What kind of social contract will be needed to build the skills and safety net to enable that transition to be successful and provide opportunities for all? Well, let me start with education, which has been a building block. I'm going to go to the previous one. Next one. Great. So, primary education in India has become virtually universal, and you can see from the top graph those two lines going up steadily. And as in many countries, the challenge has now shifted from getting children into primary school but to focusing on quality, which remains a huge challenge. Importantly in India, the huge gap between boys and girls has been closed. And now they're actually, female enrollment rates at the primary level now exceed boys. In terms of secondary education, again, the same story can be seen with rapid progress, the two lines at the bottom, again, with a closing of the gender gap. If you look at tertiary education, India is the very bottom chart there. You can see that tertiary numbers have also grown, but probably more slowly than other parts of the world, and the levels are still far below what they are elsewhere. While the numbers have gone up, though, in India, spending hasn't kept up, and spending per student as a share of GDP per capita has fallen. India is also, like other parts of the world, on the cusp of the global trend of having female tertiary enrollment exceeding that of males. So you will soon find that there are many more Indian women in universities than men. Now, where India is very different than the advanced economies is in its demographics. India's young population poses very different challenges than what's faced in the advanced economies. Here you can see the proportion of the working age to dependent population in India. By 2020, 2/3 of the population in India will be between the ages of 15 and 64. And they will have to support a relatively small dependent population of about 33%. And that favorable demographic will last until about the middle of this century. But by 2050, India too will start to age. And by 2100, about a quarter of India's population will be over 65. The other big difference in India is that, unlike the rest of the world, female labor force participation remains low and is actually declining. Now, Indian women mainly work in the informal sector. 70% of women are employed in the informal sector. But Indian women also have the highest proportion of unpaid work in the world. Not too fast. There you go. India is the top of that chart and the major outlier. About half of young Indian women are not in employment, education, or training. And what's apparent when you see these numbers is that the social contract in India continues to rely very heavily on unpaid female labor, despite the fact that women in India are increasingly educated. Now, my guess is that will change rapidly in the years to come. More educated women will want to work outside the home, and it will become necessary to maintain standards of living and people's aspirations, and the social contract will have to adjust to accommodate that. In part because the economic rationale in terms of higher incomes is so compelling. If more women in India were supported to work in the labor market, India would be much, much richer. Now, in terms of social protection, India's system has expanded enormously, away from a narrow focus of only providing social protection to workers in the formal labor market to now encompass benefits for 90% of workers in the informal sector. Now, that evolution has been based on a major expansion of programs under 5 pillars. The first is school meals, The second is the Integrated Child Development Service, which provides nutrition, health, and preschool education for children under 6. Third is the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. Fourth, which provides 100 days of public works for those at low incomes. Fourth is the public distribution system, which provides subsidized food. And fifth is the Social Security pension system for widows, the elderly, and disabled. Health insurance has also been introduced for large catastrophic diseases leading to hospitalization, and although that's been introduced, coverage is still low, but it's growing. These programs now reach a significant proportion of the Indian population. 50% of children in India now receive free school meals. 29% of rural households earn some income from public works. 52% received subsidized wheat or rice. 22% of widows now receive a pension. And as such, these programs provide a minimum floor on poor people's incomes and improve the opportunities for very young children born into poor families by improving their nutrition, supporting their school attendance, and performance. For example, the school meal program reduces the daily calorie deficit for poor children by 30% and the protein deficit by 100%. And they have a significant effect on enrollment, especially in grade 1, and a dramatically positive impact on learning achievement. Now, given the scale of these programs, their complexity, rapid expansion, and the very different capacities of states across India, the delivery of these benefits has been uneven, and one has to acknowledge that. For example, the National Employment Guarantee Scheme has had problems with corruption, such as attendance being inflated by local officials who pocket the difference, and delays in wage payments. The program has been better at targeted income transfer than the development of skills or the building of useful productive assets. Nevertheless, it's generated 2 billion days of productive work, half of which has been done by women, more than half by scheduled castes or tribes with huge evidence of gains in reducing rural poverty. There have also been real gains for agricultural wages, although the usefulness of the public works that have been constructed is much debated. As usual, these programs are far more effective in better managed states, but they're improving over time, and states with poorer governance are converging to the performance of the better managed states over time. So even though public social expenditure in India has grown faster than other budgetary items, it's gone from about a fifth of government spending in 1990 to about a quarter in 2015 and 16. India's social spending is still low by international standards. I'm going to skip. If I show you, oops, there you go. By international standards and compared to a group of other Asian economies, there is still a long way to go. And recent years have also seen experimentation with some new models such as investment in infrastructure projects, building houses, providing toilets and gas cylinders, as well as income transfers such as cash transfers to farmers. Perhaps what's most distinctive about India's approach has been the initial focus on rights, and that's resulted in some important successes, but also some important challenges, particularly around resources, accountability, and administrative capacity. The successes, which should be acknowledged, have been largely around inclusion. Because most states in India have opted for virtually universal entitlements to benefits and only excluded households with obvious wealth. Why bother to target when such a large proportion of the population is eligible? And the gains that we see in India in terms of universal primary enrollment, closing the gender gap in education, immunization, antenatal care, are all good examples of the progress with this approach. Now, the challenges have been in part driven by a lack of government funding, which has been a perennial constraint given the huge needs and the relatively low level of taxation and tax revenues. And while social sector spending as a whole has gone up as a share of GDP, education and health have not changed much as a share. much of the spending has been on protecting citizens rather than making them more productive. And areas such as vocational training have been very under-resourced. Now, environmental rights have actually also gone up the agenda. Air and water pollution and lack of access to sanitation violate human rights and are particularly damaging for poor people. And there is now a lively debate in India about the right to breathe and the huge social costs of both outdoor and indoor air pollution. Increasingly, these environmental issues are being seen as central to the social contract in India. Now, I would argue that there are many reasons to argue that now is the ideal time to be debating what social contract would best serve India in the 21st century. Why now? Well, because recent progress in economic growth and the potential for increased tax revenues mean that over time, the financing constraint will ease. And India will start to spend much higher levels of GDP in these areas. The establishment of the Aadhaar National Identity Scheme and the rapid expansion of bank accounts means that there is much greater scope for providing benefits directly to citizens and be less dependent on the quality of local bureaucracies. A growing middle class will demand higher quality services and will reward politicians who deliver them. Political competition will increase pressure. There is some evidence that those states where you have very tight competition between two strong parties, like the BJP versus Congress, or between two party blocs, such as in Kerala and in West Bengal, they deliver better results in terms of quantity and quality of social spending, while places where you have very fragmented political structures like Bihar and UP have worse outcomes. And finally, closing the gender gap in India will have consequences. We already see that states with large shares of educated women in paid employment achieve much better outcomes in health and education. So let me draw this to a close by talking a little bit more about India and LSE and the future. The social contract that I've talked about today has been a theme that has been at the center of so many debates at LSE and in India, and it is clearly at a moment of flux. Once again, we are trying to understand how to achieve both economic success and social progress, but in a very different technological, social, and environmental context. Good social contracts will enable modernization of the economy because everyone in society would believe that they'll be looked after during the inevitable dislocations that result. Rather than vested interests blocking reforms, as we've seen with the rise of protectionism in many of the advanced economies, a just social contract provides equal opportunities for all and gives everyone a stake in a different and better future. One of my distinguished predecessors, Ralph Dahrendorf, wrote, quote, "The story of LSE and India runs deep in both places. It is, in a sense, a story of soulmates." And as I've tried to illustrate today, that story has been populated by some extraordinary characters as well as a set of intellectual preoccupations that they shared. But like the social contract that needs to be renewed for a new era, we at the LSE are keen not to rest on our laurels of this extraordinary 100-year relationship with India, but we want to keep our relationship with India vibrant and refreshed. And that's why an important reason for my visit is to launch our new LSE India initiative, which seeks to mobilize resources to support more research and teaching on India by faculty at LSE, build more collaboration with Indian scholars and researchers, fund more scholarships for talented Indian students. And just last night, I was pleased that we were able to announce our first contribution to a new program of Gandhi scholarships that we're launching at the LSE. And we want to encourage our active engagement with Indian policymakers. I would love to think that in 50 years' time, one of my successors will be standing in this great hall, telling a story with a series of new extraordinary characters and ideas that emerged from our collaboration that help India and the world build economic success alongside social progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minouche. As you've just seen, Minouche is way beyond a fine university leader. She is also an intellectual leader and social scientist, indeed economist of great distinction. Thank you so much, Minouche. That's very deep and thoughtful and made us all think. And some of the personal side struck home to me very deeply because IG Patel, who I knew and was like an uncle to me, also hired me to the LSE. It was the first time I got a job at the school, and Harold Lasky taught my mother when she was at the LSE in the late 1930s, so it was all very close to home. Also close to home is the State Bank of India, because they supported very strongly and generously the IG Patel Chair from the beginning, and we're enormously grateful to that. So this is the moment now to turn to Rajneesh Kumar. Rajneesh, if you have any thoughts, questions, challenges, please, now is the moment.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a great honor and privilege for the State Bank of India to be associated with IG Patel Chair when it was established in collaboration with Reserve Bank of India in 2006. I had the privilege of working in London for 3 years, and that is when I came in touch with Ruth and Nicholas, and we developed a very good friendship, and it continues. And Ruth is always very persuasive. Many of you may not be knowing, and when this series was being planned, and she has been in touch with me that how can SBI and LSE once again can support in this endeavor. And I'm very happy that SBI, we got this opportunity. And about the topic, so when it was given that it is social contracts for 21st century, honestly, I didn't understand exactly what it meant. But thanks to Minouche, if I've pronounced correctly your name, and everything is so clear after just 1 hour. And as the State Bank of India, I can say, or the banking system in this country, I can say that we have been an integral part of this emerging social contracts in 21st century in India by setting up a huge infrastructure which enables the government to transfer the benefits under whether it is Manrega or any other subsidy schemes of the government. The financial inclusion in India, where 360 million accounts have been opened across the country. And the change in the social contracts which is coming, I don't think that in India it would have been possible unless supported by the banks, and particularly public sector banks in this country. But definitely in 1 hour, everything about the history, it was some sort of a nostalgia to go back into history, and then the global perspective on social contracts and how they are being reshaped. And because as I had the privilege of working in Canada as well as in UK and born and brought up, of course, in it. So I was just like mesmerized and could visualize how she has, in a very simple and effective manner, brought out what is happening across the globe. And maybe after globalization and today when we are seeing all the tensions around the trade, probably in one of our slides lies the mystery that the middle class in emerging economies have benefited more than the middle class in the developed world. And possibly this could be the cause of tension what we are seeing today. And in some sort of wave in 91, it was all about globalization, and now after 30 years, it is all about nationalism and protectionism, which is emerging everywhere across the globe. But really, like for a uninitiated or who has not studied social science, picture is perfect, very clear, and very easy to comprehend. So I'm really delighted about this wonderful, I should use the word lecture or whatever is the right word, but definitely after, when we go out, we are much wiser about what is happening in the society. So these are just some of my comments. And finally about, like this is first time I am visiting this hall. I had offered Ruth that we can do this program in our auditorium, but I think she made the right choice. And when you're sitting here, you feel that you are in the Guildhall of London. I attended many events there, and this reminds me of Guildhall of London. So no venue could have been better than this in my view. And I compliment Ruth for making the right selection. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rajneesh, for a very thoughtful and speedy response, because you didn't know what was coming when you. So it was really helpful. Thank you. Now we have about 15 minutes or so for interaction and questions. I hope we've got roving mics. Where are the roving mics? There are two, yes? One either side. And could I have a quick show of hands about how many people are planning to ask questions? Okay. I think, and that will grow, so I think it takes 3 at a time. Could I also remind you of a noble LSE tradition of gender balance in the questions? You know who you are. So, first, a gentleman just in about 3 rows back there.
Thank you, Professor Shafik, for the wonderful talk. Could you talk about, especially with regards to developing economies, of the private-public partnership and the way it is perceived, especially like in the provision of services in the welfare sector, where services were either absent or uneven, and now with the growing public-private services and the kind of reservations that many, mostly Marxist scholars have, that they are kind of a way of erosion of the services, especially in developing countries where we didn't have the services to begin with. So if you could talk about that a little bit. And very related to that, the idea of non-profits and their increasing role, and especially in health and education, and thinking about non-profits and their role in the welfare state, especially in the developing countries. So just thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'll take 2 more questions, then turn to Minouche. A gentleman just here.
It's an excellent presentation, as Dr. Rajneesh mentioned, that within 1 hour, you took us, back to square and, to the latest what's happening around the world. Madam, you hit the nail on the head that when you said, the social contract is failing, but there is an opportunity to succeed too. But you also mentioned about the divisive politics across the globe. What's happening is really frightening. Now, one important thing you missed about India is that Dr. Rajesh will agree with that the CSR contribution, the compulsory contribution which is need to go, is a huge, huge amount which can be driven to the welfare of the so-called BMAR states. What is 6 states? The third most important thing is that what you see the future of India, LSE, and the scope. If you can explain to us a little more detail, what exactly it will usher the development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And is there a lady who'd like to ask a question? Well, next time round, I'm sure it will happen. A gentleman in the front here, please. Just here? Yeah, thank you. So, you'll be first in the second round. So 3 questions, Minouche, if you could respond. And Rajesh, should you feel you'd like to come in, please just come in when you want to. Yeah. But no compulsory.
So those are big questions. Let me start with public-private partnership in the provision of services. I think it's very interesting that countries make very different choices about private versus public provision. And I would argue closer, sorry about that. So countries make very different choices and can make very many different systems work. So for example, healthcare. In the UK, we have a national health service. The private sector is kind of at the margins of it, but basically that's the predominant service. If you look in continental Europe, you have a system where there's both private and public provision of services, but the state is a single payer. So there's the state pays, but you have provision of services by an array of providers. The US system is terrible. So that is the worst possible system. But the point I want to make is that you can structure it in a way that the actual supplier of services could be public or private, but the key is that you have to have the public interest driving how the money is allocated. Same with the university sector. Again, if you look at the way the US does public versus private in financing how higher education is funded. Are you interested in infrastructure, or are you thinking social sectors? Services, okay. So across the board, okay. Okay, fine. So think about higher education. In the US system, it's highly commercial. Students have to take quasi-commercial loans and are expected to finance their own higher education. In the UK, there's a sort of blended system whereby the state gives you a loan and you only repay if you earn a certain amount. In continental Europe, the state more or less pays for everything, but they've introduced a bit of rationing and some fees. So again, a whole spectrum of public versus private. The point I want to make is there are many, many models of doing it. It's very dependent on the values of a particular society and has to be rooted in those values. And I guess my main point would be there are many ways to do it. You can have a private sector role, but it needs to be moderated by the social purpose and constraint. And in some ways that relates to your second question about the role of nonprofits. Nonprofits have a hugely important role to play, particularly in health and education and elderly care. And I think they bring often the benefit of diversity and a little bit of competition, but which is not profit motivated. So nonprofit hospitals, for example, and healthcare facilities help you to benchmark how well the state is doing. I'm not a huge fan of for-profit education, but there are some examples I know that have worked relatively well in some contexts where the public sector is unable to deliver services. But nonprofit educations are often a very good complement and healthy competitor to public provision. And then the question on, I think the question was on what exactly will the LSE India initiative do? We're just launching it. We're just about to appoint an academic director, and we've just mobilized our first funds to fund these Gandhi scholarships, which we hope to supplement and augment. It comes at a very good time. I'm not sure if some of you are aware of the news in the UK, which was announced today, which is that the post-study visa regime will change in the UK so that students who come and study in the UK can stay on to work for 2 more years, and that's a huge opportunity and is a big reason, to be honest, why we lost students from India, and I hope that that will reverse now. But what we're hoping to do is mobilize resources to promote research on India. We want more India in our curriculum so that students from all over the world learn more about India when they study about the LSE, that there are Indian case studies, Indian authors, and Indian data in what they learn at the LSE. We want to partner with Indian scholars and social scientists and universities to do more collaborative work with them. And we want to try and contribute to India's policy debates. The kinds of issues that I talked about today will be very hot topics over the next decade in India. And if we at the LSE can contribute to those debates, as well as the many other hot topics, like what is the role of the private sector in social responsibility? How does India deal with climate change? All of these are topics where we have a wealth of expertise at the LSE, and we hope that through the work that we do, we can contribute to that. And then the final question on artificial intelligence, huge impact. It will change labor markets fundamentally. I am not one of those sort of Luddite techno-pessimists who thinks that jobs will disappear and we're all going to be unemployed. People always say that when there's a major technological change. But I do think jobs will change a lot. And I think the thing about artificial intelligence is we sort of got used to people being displaced by automation in factories. But this technological revolution in artificial intelligence will also affect services fundamentally. So many jobs in areas that we didn't think of as automatable, like accounting, being a lawyer, doctors, big parts of their jobs will be automated. So for example, there are now fantastic diagnostic tools which use artificial intelligence to diagnose people's illnesses with much higher of accuracy than human doctors can achieve. But that isn't going to displace doctors altogether, because people will still want a human to talk to about their diagnosis and their treatment plan. So there are some real opportunities, but I do think every country in the world is underinvesting in preparing their labor market for this change. The only country I know that spends a decent amount is Denmark. They spend about 1.7% of GDP on what they call active labor market policies. And they have a very clear strategy for how Danish workers are being prepared for the digital revolution. Other countries spend, the UK spends 1/100th of what Denmark spends, just to give you a sense of scale. And so I think there needs to be a huge shift in the years ahead to fund much more active labor market policies to prepare workers for a future in which artificial intelligence will be very important.
So we have time for one more round. There's a lady at the front here. Could you hold it a bit closer? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it is believed that now that women are working more, the family life and family values are deteriorating. So you said that closing the gender gap will lead to economic advancement, but how do you argue that closing the gender gap will also lead to social progress? Because in India, people don't believe that, which is not true. But how do you argue against it that yes, it will lead to social progress?
Thank you very much. And there's a lady just 3 rows back there.
Thank you. When we speak of social contract, it also means that the legitimacy that the state has with an individual. And in countries like India, I think it's not only a foreign case, that often the state is not legitimate or considered legitimate, but it
Sorry, can you repeat the question again? On the,
Yes. Despite being the provider of welfare, the Indian state still lacks legitimacy. And in my understanding, that is an essential part of the social contract. So in a country with this much diversity and different understandings of what the state is, how could we address that? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have just the last question, the person right at the back, the furthest back.
Very enlightened lecture, ma'am. Social contract is basically a reciprocal process. I want to highlight in case of India, we have seen the highest unemployment rate that is in the automobile market, where the state as a society is failing to provide services. But at the same time, we could see a nationalistic tendencies which would see the solidarity of many people towards the state. So how do you analyze the dichotomy vis-a-vis social contract in India?
okay, nice big
getting more
questions.
political.
Yes, exactly. All right, so let's start with the question around women. I have to say, this debate has occurred in all countries about as women work more, will families break down, and so on. I think education results, there's a sort of an inevitability in the path that you get on, because I think, families, I don't know, we all have children, right? Some of us have children, and we can see that our boys and our girls are equally capable. I observe it particularly with men who have daughters, and they see that their daughters are very capable, and they're puzzled as to, I think over time they start to wonder, why doesn't my daughter have the same opportunity that my son has? And I think that opens up conversations in families. I also think that aspirations are such that for people to aspire to a higher quality of life, increasingly 2 incomes is becoming necessary, particularly in urban areas. And that economic pressure is very real. Labor-saving technologies will make it easier. I think you saw the data on how much unpaid labor Indian women do. I think having men help at home a bit makes it a bit easier. And I think you can see that because in most advanced economies, men increasingly do more unpaid labor at home to share that burden. But I think the logic of as women get more educated and their productivity goes up and their potential earning power goes up, the economic pressures will overcome the kind of social resistance that you describe. I think the question on the last 2 questions were similar in terms of the legitimacy of the state, how the welfare state is being delivered in India, and how credible that is. I think your premise is absolutely right. There is reciprocity in the social contract, and that reciprocity is, I as a citizen am willing to pay tax if I get good public services in exchange. That's the basic contract. And we've done some interesting research at the LSE in Bihar, in fact, on what makes people pay their electricity bills in Bihar. And what we found is that there is no relationship between paying your bill and getting service. It's completely random. So some people pay their bills and others don't, and they all get more or less the same bad service. And we did a randomized controlled trial of an experiment, and this is some research done by our International Growth Center, which showed, what if we, for those people who pay their bills, they'll get more power on a more consistent basis. And sure enough, and this was done over thousands of villages across Bihar over several years, when you linked the quality of service to willingness to pay, people paid more. And I think there's an important lesson in that for the state, to realize that in order for us to get people to pay and be willing to pay a tax or a fee, we have to deliver higher quality service. And why weren't people paying? Because service was erratic, because they didn't get bills on a monthly basis. It would often come 6 months later. And if you were a poor person, you couldn't afford a big lump sum. But if they had billed properly, so they had to improve billing and the regularity of service. I mean, it's a small example, but I think it reflects a wider principle, which is true everywhere in the world. You know, when I was at the IMF, we did research on what made people willing to pay tax. And a hugely important variable was if everyone else is paying. And so people are willing to contribute to the social contract and to make their public contribution if they feel that it's fair and everyone else is paying. And countries that have very low tax compliance are countries where evasion is widespread, where cheating is widespread, where there's corruption in collection. So this is an evolutionary process. I think states learn that if they keep up their side of the social contract and deliver better services, they'll be able to collect more tax. And I think India is moving along that journey. The tax take is still relatively low in India. I have no doubt that it will go up over time. And in order for that to happen, the Indian states will have to deliver better quality public services.
Thank you. Now, the life force behind this lecture is sitting on my right. It's Ruth Katamuri. And she has indicated that because we started late, we could take one more round, provided that those questions are very short and speedy. Rajneesh, at the beginning, you reminded us of the persuasiveness of Ruth, so it's already been manifested one more time. But we'll go round in one more of three, but please keep them very short. The gentleman right at the front. Who, sir?
My name is Lucas. It's not really a question, it's more a comment. I was going to take it offline since almost everyone spoke about the menu by level. This is, when you make the service, I've got your mention. It is the venue, but I worked at the city, I studied at the city. So
Could you keep it closer
so I know.
and recognize the virtue of brevity, if you could, yeah.
So how much effort this went into identifying a venue and organizing an event. And one of the first things that we always did was make sure that the venue was physically accessible. And this venue is almost pathetic. There's zero effort put in terms of accessibility. The washrooms are stair heights up, and it's terrible. So the reason why I have to bring it up is so that all of you are aware of it, audience over here is aware of it, and most importantly, your representatives hear this. And they could do more with maintaining the building and maintaining the facilities and just making it a bit more accessible, which is now really a law. So I'm surprised that I've done it.
Thank you. And can we note that, but also that it's a message for the London School of Economics and other institutions, not just this one. Usha, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you. No, this is actually more a puzzle. We've been hearing about the gender gap closing, and very clearly, even in the tertiary education, there are more intakes in India. But when you look at the female participation ratio, it's coming down. I somehow don't get this. And I wonder whether this is being researched by London School of Economics. How do you explain it? It's sort of not making sense to me.
Is the lady just over there? Yeah.
Thank you very much for your illuminating presentation. I believe a sustained social contract would require a viable platform for social dialogue. And in India, it is being observed that various institutional platforms for social dialogue are corroding or eroding. And, so in the situation of not having an adequate platform for social dialogue, how do you explain that renewed pledge for healthier social contract will emerge in India?
So on the puzzle that you identify, I am also incredibly puzzled by this because it's contrary to the pattern in other parts of the world. I've seen one piece of research on this, and the explanation, there is a bit of, social, cultural norms, et cetera, but that's true in other parts of the world as well. I think that where female labor force participation has fallen in India is among married rural women. If you look at unmarried women and urban women, those numbers seem to be going up into a pattern that you see in other parts of the world. So there's something going on about it not being worth the while of married rural women to work in the formal labor market. And I think that has something to do with wages and the kind of jobs that are available to women in rural areas. And the kind of support that they might have in order to be able to take those jobs. That's the only piece of research I have seen and the only explanation I've seen. But I agree with you. It's not, there may be something else going on here, and it's definitely an area that we should do more research on. I would be amazed if this trend continues. On the need for a platform for social dialogue, you're absolutely, it's a problem in India, it's a problem everywhere. Is where do these discussions happen? I think we have to create the platforms where these debates happen. Because so much of the social contract, these decisions are taken implicitly and in a fragmented way without people really being aware of the huge consequences of decisions around how we organize our educational system or the structure of the health scheme and who is eligible or not. And we also very rarely put it together. That was part of the genius of William Beveridge when he thought about the welfare state in the UK, is he put it all together so that there was a cradle to grave. Here's what happens when you're young, here's what happens when you work, here's what happens when you get sick. And thinking about that relationship of the citizen and the state in an integrated way is quite powerful, and also allows you to make some trade-offs, which you might not if you look at it piece by piece. So I would just encourage the creation of such platforms in India. I think, especially as I said, I think India is on the cusp of a major change in its social contract, and the decisions you make now will have ripple effects for decades and decades. I'll just give you a small example. It seems incredibly trivial. If I were India today, I would link retirement ages to life expectancy now, because no one is going to have an argument about it, because it's an issue that won't affect you for decades to come, so you won't have a big political row like we have in Europe about what retirement ages should be. But if you do it now, you will not face any of the problems that other countries have faced with an aging population putting fiscal pressure and not being willing to work longer to finance their old age. That's an example of a decision that would be easy in India's current political economy, but would have huge long-term benefits for India's society and fiscal sustainability. And so I would really encourage those kind of debates to be happening, and for citizens to create platforms to have those discussions.
It remains for me to do some thank yous. Thank you again to our hosts for their organizing and their hospitality for a special event for us in a very special place. Thank you, Ruth, for all the work and skill and commitment that went into making this a very special occasion. Thank you, Rajneesh, for your very thoughtful comments and for the support of the SBI to the school, particularly in relation to my chair, but also that very close relationship which we treasure. And thank you, Minouche, for a really very powerful and thoughtful lecture. And as you were talking, I was just running through the social science disciplines that you covered, just organizing it by departments at the LSE. There are other ways of doing it, but philosophy, economics, law, statistics, politics and government, international relations, finance, and of course, especially social administration and policy. It's at least 8 disciplines, 8 departments. It shows not only that LSE is a social science university, but our director is a real social scientist. So. And let's finish where Minouche finished, which is about the relationship between LSE and India. It's been a big part of my own life for the 45 years that I've been coming, and I plan another 2 or 3 decades of coming to India. But I think Minouche showed us very clearly that the next 2 decades is definitional for India. It will define, in many ways, the sustainability from the environmental point of view of India's economy. It will define its sustainability from the point of view of the kind of social contract it builds and the kind of social contract it finances or is able to finance. It'll be definitional in terms of politics, and above all, it will be definitional in terms of India's relationship with the world. This is India's century, and we want at the LSE to be a supporter, a part of that story that gets behind India and helps in whatever way we can to shape the way in which India will determine the future of the world over this century. They'll all be India's choices, but we hope that you will look to your friends at the LSE to play our part in our supporting role. So thank you very much indeed for coming. Thank you, Minouche, and thanks to everybody involved. Thank you.